Welcome to the Humanized Campus Spring 2022 Professional Development Workshop Series. This is Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, Session 2. The Humanized Campus is designed as a series of professional development workshops that provide safe spaces to explore important critical concepts such as cultural responsiveness, decolonization, social justice, and educational equity. It is my sincere intention that this space is used to grow individually and collectively towards a more humanized campus, community, and world. And I thank you for your commitment towards this effort. In session 1 of the Humanized Campus, we collectively discussed the definition of the word humanize and came up with several terms that I've expanded upon here. To humanize is to embody empathy, kindness, compassion, warmth, patience, understanding, love, support, advocacy, justice, fairness, positivity, empowerment, hope, elevation, and growth. We hope to infuse our practice with these characteristics to increase the success and improve the educational experiences of Delta students. As a quick review of where we've been in session 1, we discussed defining, distinguishing, and understanding culturally responsive teaching, distinctions of equity, cultural archetypes, culturally responsive brain rules, and building intellectual capacity. To recap, culturally responsive teaching are the ways that educators recognize and value students' cultural funds of knowledge, and the way that we use that knowledge as a scaffold to connect to new learning, new concepts, and new content. The goal is to increase the intellective capacity and brain power of our students, and this entails understanding that the way the brain works so that we can maximize our effectiveness as educators. Culturally responsive teaching is not simply adding cultural content into our curriculum or into our activities. It goes much deeper than surface level additions. We discussed the 6 culturally responsive brain rules that Zaretta Hammond identified as critical for culturally responsive educators to understand and practice. For the purpose of session 2, we will be focusing on 1 and 2. 1 being the brain seeks to minimize social threats and maximize opportunities to connect with others in the community. And number 2, positive relationships keep our safety threat detection system in check. In session 2, we will focus on establishing and nurturing learning partnerships through trust, rapport, and hope, and developing a community of learners and learning environment. I'm excited to begin today with a quote from GENEVA Gay, a theorist, educator, advocate, and expert in culturally responsive teaching. GENEVA Gay states, "The ultimate goal of a culturally responsive teacher is to provide resources and personal assistance so students cultivate positive self-efficacy beliefs and a positive academic mindset." One definition of an academic mindset is as follows: a student's attitudes, beliefs, and dispositions about school, learning, and his, or their capacity as a learner that are associated with effort, perseverance, and positive academic achievement. And if we look at the graphic, we see that the thoughts of students who possess an academic mindset include: I belong in this academic community. My ability and competence grow with my effort. I can succeed at this. This work has value for me, which leads to academic perseverance, behaviors, and performance. But the problem is that far too many of our students do not come to our college environment with this mindset. for a variety of reasons. So we are charged as educators, support, and counselors to help them develop this mindset. And culturally responsive teaching is one way in which to do so. James Banks, the father of multicultural education, imparts, if education is to empower culturally and linguistically diverse students, it must be transformative. Being transformative means helping students develop the knowledge, skills, and values needed to become social critics who can make reflective decisions and implement their decisions into effective personal, social, political, and economic action. So, what does this mean for our students? It means that they will be able to go beyond the ability to comprehend and memorize course content, and it transcends into a power and agency for them to analyze and act upon personal and societal inequities for the greater good of humanity. It's heavy, but it's necessary in order to transform our nation and our world. We'll now refer back to the Ready for Rigor framework for this session's content, which will focus on learning partnerships and community of learners and learning environment. Again, you should explore these two categories to determine your strengths and areas for growth. We will now move into learning partnerships in order to establish strong relationships built on trust, rapport, and hope with our students. On the importance of building rapport and trust. Rapport is defined as a sympathetic connection between students and educators that results in positive feelings and motivation when working together. Establishing rapport builds trust. Culturally and linguistically diverse students, particularly from marginalized backgrounds, often feel disconnected and they lack trust and strong relationships with their professors, teachers, and counselors. As we look at this image of the brain, we recall that the amygdala is responsible for releasing cortisol when fear or distrust is present in a student's brain. When students feel stressed, threatened, unincluded, fearful, or unsuccessful, their amygdala releases this cortisol, which can stop learning for 20 minutes and stay in their bodies for hours. On the other hand, when strong relationships and trust is established within students, their reticular activating systems produce oxytocin, which help deactivate the amygdala and block the release of cortisol. When we establish trusting relationships with students, their brains are free for activities like creativity, learning, and higher order thinking. And when trust exists, educators can provide that critical push and challenge without having students experience a potential amygdala hijack. Rapport plus alliance together equals cognitive insight that leads to the true academic success that we want for our students. Hammond includes a trust generators chart, which displays 5 different areas of trust that educational professionals can exhibit when working with students. They include selective vulnerability, familiarity, similarity of interests, concern, and competence. So, as you explore these categories of the trust generators chart, ask yourself, in what ways do you seek to connect with the students that you work with? Which ones are you really good at? And which areas are more challenging? And how can you help expand and improve and enhance your interactions with students to help build trust? The first category of the trust generators chart is selective vulnerability. Hammond writes, the most powerful thing we can do to create a culture of trust and caring is to allow ourselves to be seen as human beings, not just in our role as educators or professionals. Self-disclosure is one of the hallmarks of intimate, trusting relationships, and it's best employed through storytelling. But how often do we allow ourselves to tell stories about our lives, our experiences, our ups and downs with our students? Is this something that we're comfortable with? Some of us probably more than others. But when we tell stories, neural coupling takes place, which means that between the listener and the storyteller, brain regions light up and are activated, and connections are formed, and bonding takes place between students and their educators. And I love this quote by Audre Lorde, which says, "And that visibility which makes us most vulnerable is that which also is the source of our greatest strength." How comfortable are we with letting students see our own humanity? How often do we do it, and how do we do it? Here are a few suggestions of how you might let students in to who you are in order to form connections. You can tell your story by integrating it into your lesson. For example, what were you like as a student or a child or a young person? What were your favorite subjects, or what were some of your challenges? You might share pictures of yourself during your college days or when you were younger. You might share a new skill or a talent or a hobby that you're learning, and maybe not the finished product, but the steps along the way to show your vulnerability as a learner as well. You might share your interests with the class and find connections with students who are similar. Or you might bond over a local cause which means something important to you, and let students connect to what is important to you and to the community. And these are just a very few suggestions, and you'll have the opportunity to discuss more in a moment. But the importance is to let students in so that they can make connections with your humanity. Now we will have a reflect and discuss moment in which we explore, in what ways do we build trust and rapport with students? What are the challenges that we run into while doing so in the college environment? And how do we overcome them? Or how can we? Also, are we comfortable exhibiting selective vulnerability? Do we tell stories and share bits of our lives with students? What about the other trust generators? And you can refer back to the form in the slide if necessary. Why or why not? How do we already build trust, or how can we grow in it? One of the most crucial elements in establishing alliance in the learning partnership is the concept of hope. Ladson Billings states, empowerment through validation is a critical feature of culturally responsive teaching because it helps restore students' sense of hope. Duncan Andrade states, restoring hope is one of the main jobs for the teacher as ally in the learning partnership. When we consider our students' demographics, we are already too familiar with the challenges and the inequities and the odds stacked against them. As their educators, counselors, and support team, we have to become their hope dealers. This chart displays the several characteristics of hope. It's useful to reflect upon our own personal concepts of hope and to recognize the kinds of hope that can actually benefit culturally and ethnically diverse students. Critical hope, that which encompasses material and Socratic hope, is what our students need the most. Socratic hope states, this type comes as teachers and students examine their lives and actions within an unjust society and allow their pain to pave the path to justice, self-determination, and collective action through academic excellence. The righteous indignation or so-called student hostility it generates is seen as a strength to be channeled into positive action and engagement. So our charge is, how can we move our instruction and instill in it the Socratic hope that our students need to make changes in their lives and in their societies and communities as well. We have to reflect on and explore our personal characteristics as individuals in the educational realm. Many of us have heard of the term warm demanders, or educators who are able to balance our personal warmth and couple it with demandingness for student success. It's also known as hard caring, which is the combination of high expectations for academic performance that teachers place on students and supportive instrumental relationships between students and teachers. Student performance is optimized when they feel as if we have their back and as if we push them towards high expectations. And they also know when we don't. This chart contains 4 quadrants with 4 different characteristics of educators. There's the warm demander, the technocrat, the sentimentalist, and the elitist, with varying levels of active demandingness versus passive, and personal warmth versus professional distance. As you explore this chart, see which characteristics you fall into. Our goal is to become warm demanders so that we can best impact our students positively. So, what steps can we change about ourselves in order to grow into warm demanders? In our next reflection and discussion opportunity, we will discuss how we model and exhibit hope to and with our students. How can we help them manifest Socratic hope in our classrooms and campus? What are the challenges and how can we overcome them? In reflection of the warm demander chart, identify and share what types of educators would your students classify you as and why? And in what ways do your students feel like you have their back? What are the challenges of exhibiting warm demandingness in a college environment, and what steps can we take to grow? Part 2 of this session is Community of Learners and Learning Environment. In referring back to the Ready for Rigor framework, identify the components of the community of learners and learning environment quadrant that you are already using and those areas in which you would still like to grow. For the purpose of this session, we will now discuss how we can build classroom culture and learning around communal, social cultural talk, and task structures. One of the first steps in creating culturally responsive communities is exploring and reflecting upon the classroom environments, both in person and online, that we create. And we ask ourselves these questions. What values do our spaces communicate to our students? And what do we want them to communicate? How do we want students to experience their precious time in our classroom spaces? And this is only if applicable, as many of us share classroom spaces. But what do the artifacts on the walls communicate to students about what is important? How are they reflected? And what do we want the environment to teach to those who are in it? How do we establish an ethos of care in our environments? Culturally responsive educators and professionals know the importance of implementing routines and rituals with culturally and linguistically and ethnically diverse students. This entails the integration of affirming and communal activities that create social bonds among students and help establish interdependency. So, as educators, we must discuss the importance and the rationale of these routines with students and even invite them in to suggest ideas on what a community feels like to them and how can we invoke class norms in order to inspire that community. It includes predictable activities that students can always rely on to happen when they're in your class space. It can happen with beginning class with a centering activity or a grounding activity to release everybody's stress and to welcome them into a new lesson. You might use music to facilitate transitions from the intro to the lesson or while students are expected to work quietly or work in small groups. And we should create transitional routines for both independent work partnership work, or potential group work. And this is both in person and online. Culturally responsive educators and professionals always look for opportunities to ignite students' emotions and to connect to their spirits. This includes the recitation of affirmations, verses, or poems, the integration of short motivational speeches, TED Talks, poems, or even music videos to ignite students' interest and to connect to their culture. Perhaps you might allow students to share and reflect their own community stories or dichos, which are proverbs or sayings, and knowledge that students identify as a part of their culture and welcoming as part of your classroom process. You may also read quotes or short narratives of inspiring or relevant narratives, or allow students to do so as well. This is about attaching to the emotional and spiritual element of our students in order for them to feel truly connected to our classrooms. When creating culturally responsive communities, we simply cannot underestimate the power of student agency and voice in both in-person and online classroom environments. Social talk structures, for example, rapport talk, are allowing the time and space as a warm-up to a unit or lesson. This entails devoting maybe 5 to 10 minutes at the beginning of class for students to check in with each other. And maybe you can have a variety of talk topics that they come up with to draw from so that they can connect with each other and center themselves as they get ready for a new lesson. Another example is the sharing of digital storytelling, working in dyads, or a variety of talk structures including pairs, small groups, or rotating pairs so that they can meet each other, learn from each other, and connect with one another. And yet another form of student agency and voice are academic talk structures or instructional conversations. These are the ability to form, express, and exchange ideas through dialogue, questioning, and sharing ideas. Now, these types of conversations are focused on the academic content that we are providing in our courses. They can be accomplished in partners or trios where students present their projects or ideas to each other to get feedback and support, through an activity such as Chalk Talk, where students work in groups to write responses to units related to a lesson or a unit on sticky notes throughout the space, or through the use online of a Google Jamboard, for example, or whiteboards online. And they can also take place in rotating discussions where students rotate throughout a room discussing essential questions, or potentially by being sent to different breakout rooms to discuss essential questions related to the content of the lesson. In our final reflection and discussion space for this session, you will explore the following. In what ways does your classroom environment, both in person and online, promote affirming and communal activities that create social bonds among your students and establish interdependency? What are your challenges potentially in doing so, and what steps can you take to establish rituals and routines for building community? Number two, how do you provide students opportunity to engage in social, academic, and instructional conversations in both in-person and online environments? What are your challenges again, and what are steps that you can take to integrate student voice and agency in your classroom environment and instruction? Thank you so much for your engagement in session 2 of the Humanized Campus, Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain. I hope that the discussions, reflections, and strategies presented in these first 2 workshops are valuable and applicable to your practice towards helping our culturally and linguistically diverse students become more successful in our classrooms. Have a wonderful summer, and I hope to see you in the fall.